Hello, and welcome to this week's Jessica Recommends. I am your host, Jessica. And as you can tell, if you watched last week's video, or maybe just from my shirt, this week we're talking about vampires. We're going to talk a lot about Dracula, um, but just vampires also in general. This is my shirt from Dracula the Ballet. It's my favorite ballet. I discovered it a couple of years ago when Ballet West put it on. Had to get the t-shirt. We've seen it twice now, my sister and I. It's our favorite. It's really, really stunning. The music is gorgeous. The costumes and everything that they did are so phenomenal. And then last year in October, when we went to see it, we took my husband with us. He has never been to the ballet before. And a fist fight broke out. And he was like, wow, no wonder you love the ballet so much. Is it always this exciting? We're like, no, what is happening? Middle of the ballet. Apparently, some very drunk people up in the box had to be removed. They started threatening somebody, punching people, had to be dragged out through the entire auditorium. Bless their hearts, those dancers just kept going. Nobody even looked their way. It was impressive because we were all like stage, fight, stage, fight. It was great. Really cool. Anyway, sometimes you go to the ballet and a fight breaks out. It's amazing. But Dracula the Ballet is actually a prequel story that was written specifically for this ballet. And it's really neat. It's very different, and I really love it. So if you can ever find a place that's doing Dracula as a ballet, go see it. Highly recommend. Because I am just a big Dracula fan. So uh, I like a good vampire story. I like a bad vampire story. But specifically, Dracula, I read the first time when I was really young, like an abridged kids' classic version, and just found something about the story really cool and appealing. The gothic imagery and the castle on the hill, and oh, we can turn into a bat. I got my little bat earrings on, or a wolf, and all these things. And so, got really into it, have read the full unabridged book several times, and have multiple editions of it that I'm going to show off. And it inspired me so much that I actually ended up writing a book that's sort of an homage to Dracula. It is also, it's semi-epistolary, it's not fully epistolary. I did consider doing that, but decided not to. It took some of the action away from it. But Silver in the Blood, my darling baby book that is actually out of print currently, but we're looking at some options, my agent and I, for bringing it back. But this is sort of the book of my heart. It is loosely based on or in the style of Dracula, if you will. It's giving Dracula, it's Dracula vibes. And the actual book Dracula was published at the time that this book is set. And so I did have someone who had read it who thought there were vampires running around and it's vampires, and I had a lot of fun with it. So Silver in the Blood, sort of my special little book that doesn't get enough attention. And but it is because I wrote it because I love Dracula so much. This is my favorite of my editions of the unabridged actual story of Dracula. It is illustrated by Edward Gorey, who I just adore. Look at how fabulous this is. This is velvet. It's fuzzy and soft, and there are bats all around it. So if you are looking for a copy of Dracula to own and love and cherish, look for the one illustrated by Edward Gorey. I have Pop-Up Dracula, which obviously is not the entire story, but is a huge favorite. It was a huge favorite randomly with my daughter when she was very small. She used to read this book to herself. She used to read it to herself. And this is what is happening here? Someone's being staked. Um, she used to tell herself this story, and it was the cutest thing you'll ever see. This girl could like barely talk, and then she'd go like, "Oh no, big dog, woof woof, ow, ha 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 ha," and she just loved it so much. And I loved watching her read Dracula to herself. So that's a really fun one. It's done by Graphic Pops, Classic Pop-Up Tales. It is sort of like a looks like a comic book inside. The actual text and stuff like that is presented like a comic book. Baby Lit, your moment of Baby Lit for the week. Baby Lit's Dracula, which is a counting book, is also one of our family's favorites. about the three wolves, there was something along with the Frankenstein one that was just so attractive to my youngest when he was a baby and these were just coming out. And I think it may have been for this, the color scheme. There was something about this purple and black combo. You never see it in any other baby books. Everything else was very light, very pastel, but the stark contrast, 9 boxes, was really appealing to his eyes. And he loved this one especially. He liked to hold it and he liked to just look at the colors. He didn't even care if people read it to him. He just wanted to touch it. And I think it was the colors. There is a fabulous comic book presented for younger readers of Dracula as well, which is just sort of a first installment. It's basically Jonathan Harker's story presented as a comic book, and it's really fun. The art is super great. I found this sort of by accident. It's an all action classic. It's called an action classic, all action classic, and it is done by All Action Classics. It's done by Caldwell as the artist, and it's really well done. And so highly recommend this if you can find it. I stumbled on it randomly at a Barnes and Noble that was getting rid of everything because they were moving to a new location. Dracula, Mickey Mouse presents Dracula with stickers. It's really great. People always joke about like, oh, I want to see the Muppets do this and that classic, but I also enjoy seeing the main Mickey Mouse characters do it. I mean, Daisy is Lucy. Of course, Minnie is Mina. It's just fantastic. I love it so much. This thing is a hoot. I can't even believe this exists. Like Disney's Dracula featuring Mickey and Friends with 40 stickers. If you want to get into more like who was Dracula, the person, because he was a real person, Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, this is excellent. I use this for my research, some of my research for my book Silver in the Blood. In Search of Dracula, there is also a History Channel documentary that is taken largely from this book. In Search of Dracula, The History of Dracula and Vampires by Raymond T. McNally and Radu Florescu. Really excellent, really interesting. And after reading this, my husband came with me and I did a research trip around Romania. And I specifically made sure to go to the sites mentioned in here that were the actual places where supposedly, Vlad had lived, his residences, churches he built, his place he was born and stuff like that. And it was really fascinating, really gorgeous country, a lot of very, very interesting history, not just of Dracula, but just in general. So, if you're looking for a nonfiction look at how this all got started and what the obsession with vampires was back in the day, this is your place to go, McNally and Florescu. If you're looking for sort of a teen historical fiction take on Dracula, Kirsten White and I Darken. This is the first book in a trilogy, which is now complete, about it's gender swap. So it's Vlada Dracula as a teenager, like getting started on her career as an impaler. And these are really good, really interesting. And then she has a brand new book out. Kirsten loves a Dracula story, much as I do. She's also written a book, Lucy Undying, which just barely came out, which is sort of Dracula from the point of view of our friend Lucy. And so if you know about Dracula, you know who Lucy is. So those are really fun. Those are like my Dracula recommendations. But let's move on to other vampires. And of course, we're starting with our kids' books, like Per the Huge, Vampenguin. I bet you didn't think I could find that many picture books that were vampire based, but oh boy, can I, and they are great. Vampenguin, written and illustrated by Lucy Ruth Cummins, is delightful. The Dracula family goes to the zoo for a day out, and they accidentally swap their baby for a penguin, and they carry a penguin, goes in the stroller all around the zoo and keeps the other animals keep trying to tell them. Meanwhile, their baby is back there basically becoming the lord of the penguins back in the penguin habitat. It is delightful. We love that one so much. It just came out a couple of years ago. And Vampires of Blinch by Daniel Pinkwater with pictures by Erin Renier. This was a surprise and is an absolute delight. This is basically a travel guide to a small town called Blinch, which is entirely vampires. The people of the town are all vampires. So it's sort of a travel guide. Like, this is what the police looks like. This is what they do for fun. This is where people live. This is what they eat. This is what they do. Like, it is a travel guide to the Vampire Town of Blinch by Daniel Pinkwater. So fun. Really love this. Just kind of unusual too, as well. I mean, it's just kind of an odd little book. It's a picture book, but it's not really a good read aloud. It's one where you want to sit and look at all the little things happening. The pictures are very busy. There's sort of more minimal words. It's not really like a coherent story. It's a travel guide to this town. So, I mean, look at how fun the back is. The art is just so great. The art is to die for. Sorry, I'll stop. Moving on a little bit older, we have Upside Down, A Vampire Tale by Jess Smart Smiley, which is a really cute, sort of like a cute little littlest vampire type of graphic novel that he did a few years ago. I really enjoy this one. It's super fun and just the story about this little vampire. And that's a really cute one. And it's sort of an early reader, maybe just a little bit older. Like, it's not like a first I can read on my own, but it like a early middle grade book is what I would call it. And of course, speaking of middle grades, and I've talked about this before, but I'm holding it up again because it is so great and it's perfect for this. Sarah Boateng's Guide to Vampire Hunting by Roseanne A. Brown. It's one of the Rick Riordan Presents series and is about a girl whose family are legendary vampire hunters, but they are from Ghana. So it is very specific to their folk tales, what their vampires look like. It is very different from the Dracula vampire. It is really, they are creepy and scary and unusual, and they have different ways of hiding and mimicking people and taking them over and stuff like that. And what Sarah and her friends and cousin use to fight the vampires is a very specific type of magic from their ancestors in Ghana. The weapons are all very traditional, and it's really cool, very fun, very magical, and like a really interesting look at another culture's take on vampires, other than just the like European look at vampires. Moving on up to our middle graders. Peeps and The Last Days by Scott Westerfeld, whom you may know as the Uglies series, Uglies, Pretties, those books. There's just a Netflix movie that just came out of Uglies. But I found these first and really, really loved them. They were some of his earlier stuff. Hopefully they're still around because this is really interesting. This kid is infected. Right, reverse camera. This kid is infected by someone with essentially the vampire like virus, but he's only a carrier. So he passes it on to like his other girlfriends. And so there is this plague sort of spreading through these pretty teens of vampirism. And it's really unusual look at it. It sort of almost seems like a zombie story or something like that more than the traditional vampire story. It's really good, really interesting. So Peeps and The Last Days are the two books, and it's a 2-book series. Drink, Slay, Love by Sarah Beth Durst. I swear I could find one of her books for every category I'm going to talk about because she has done everything and she's done it so well. Drink, Slay, Love is so great. It is about a teen vampire, and she does dress like you would expect, like black lace corsets and, pleather leggings and stuff like that. And someone kind of calls her on it, and she's like, I'm being ironic. You expect me to dress this way, so I'm going to dress this way. Um, so Drink, Slay, Love, super fun. There was actually a movie of it and I never got to see it. It was like a Lifetime movie randomly. Like, I always associate those with like true stories of women who survived somewhere or something like that. But they did Drink, Slay, Love. I have not been able to find a copy and see it. I hope it's good because this book is so fun and so quirky. And there's kind of a surprise about the guy as well. He has sort of a secret he's hiding, and he is not a vampire, but he is hiding a secret, and it's very unusual. And I really loved that one. Fangs by Sarah Anderson. Sarah Anderson is the artist and author of Sarah Scribbles, the really delightful, just like sort of modern comics, like Big Happy Mushy Lump and things like that. But she had a blog where she did this ongoing series about a modern day vampire. Well, she's modern day, she's quite old, but she meets this cool hipster guy, and they just look like modern youngsters in love. He wears plaid shirts and has a little man bun. She likes to dress dramatically and in black lace. She's a vampire and he is a werewolf. And it is the cutest story. I love it to pieces. It's more for adults or maybe older teens and stuff like that. It doesn't get super racy. This is about as racy as it gets, but it's just real darling. The watching the two of them like learn how to be together when she is a vampire and he's a werewolf. So it's super cute. Sunshine by Robin McKinley. Robin McKinley wrote an adult vampire story, and it is really interesting because this was sort of it was pre-Twilight, I'm gonna say, but it was still, post Interview with the Vampire, where we were seeing vampires as good and sexy and love interests and stuff like that, like quite a bit. And this is different. This is different. This girl meets a vampire, but I mean, he's dead and very old and not really interested in her. So it's not a love story. And I know a lot of people go in expecting that, but it is really interesting. It's very different. It's a world where sort of magic has kind of come back. Like there are instances where there are fairies, there are people who have magic, but it's just like, present day setting, but they're sort of dealing with magic in the world again and vampires. And this is really good. And I highly recommend it, but you need to know what you're expecting if you were or go in like knowing what you're getting. Basically, if you are expecting one of her young adult books, like, or a romance or something like that, that is not what this is. This is different. And yes, Interview with the Vampire. I was an Interview with the Vampire girly and the Vampire Lestat. I don't know how many times I've read these. I have read most of the series up until just the last few, where I just sort of got tapped out a little bit. But I love the first few of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. Love them. I was one of those girls that in high school, most of my personality formed around being obsessed with this, reading articles about Anne Rice, sneaking out, lying to my parents, and going to see the Interview with the Vampire movie with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt and having the poster on my wall, even though I swore to my mom it was just because I liked the book and I had never seen the movie. Um, these are better than you remember. And if you have not read them yet, they're better than you've heard. It presents just such a lush, gorgeous supernatural world. Is so interesting. Lestat, especially just his take on humanity and on his fellow vampires and how he sees them and how becoming a vampire affects people, how it sort of enhances their personalities. It brings out their best qualities as well as their worst qualities. And it's really interesting as he goes along, like the people he encounters, like what they have become over the centuries as vampires versus how they started out or how they interact with human beings is really good, really interesting. Highly recommend, especially the first two, which is hilariously sort of a he said, because Interview is like, Louis going, "Oh, Lestat is the worst. I hate him so much." And Lestat is going like, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, let me tell you something." So I actually read Vampire Lestat first, and I think that affected as well, like how impatient I kind of was with Louis the first time I read Interview with the Vampire, and how I was like, "That's not what Lestat meant. I will defend him. He's so picked on as a child." So Cold Days by Jim Butcher. I'm actually just holding up this one because it was the easiest one for me to snag off the shelves, but Cold Days is really good. It is part of his Dresden Files series. If you don't know about these, Harry Dresden is a wizard who he doesn't do birthday parties. He is a real wizard. He works as a consultant with the police. He is a private investigator. He uses his wizardry powers for that around Chicago, finding missing kids, things like that. And there are very much vampires in this world, a presence. There are several courts and types of vampires. There are some that do feed on blood and pain, and there are some that actually feed off of lust and emotion. And it's really interesting. There's white court, red court, all this stuff going on with the vampires. The first book is, oh golly, Stormfront. First book is Stormfront, but it's, I don't know, buried somewhere back there. But Cold Days and the more recent ones, they're getting better and better, which is unusual for a series that's been going on. This is probably like book 16 or something like that. And I feel like they're getting better. The cast of characters, some are vampires, some are humans, some are undead Valkyries from the beginning of time, like all kinds of people that he meets. Bigfoot is a character in these, just really unusual. And I love how they weave together. I love how hilarious Harry is in the face of everything he's been through, and they'll make you laugh, they'll make you cry. They're incredibly intense. They are very much meant for kids. And yeah, vampires are a huge part of this, and they're a very interesting take on vampires as well. Barbara Hambly's Those Who Hunt the Night and Traveling with the Dead. This is two-book series about James Asher, who is a human professor at Cambridge in England, who is asked by a vampire to help solve basically a serial killer who's killing all these vampires, and he becomes exposed to the world of vampires. It's late Victorian, early Edwardian age, I'm going to say. His wife becomes a part of it. She is delightful, and so they basically are the humans who go helping some vampires solve some vampire crimes. It has a lot to do with, like, sort of reminds you of a Sherlock Holmes, like a detective thing, as well as being like very gothic, very vampire. So these are super fun. I don't know if these are out of print or at least hard to find, but I know copies are out there. Those Who Hunt the Night and Traveling with the Dead. So good. Look for them. Guilty Pleasures by Laurel K. Hamilton is the first book in her Anita Blake series. I found these, gosh, living in Delaware, New Jersey, somewhere well over 20 years ago when they first started out, and there were only 3 or 4 books. Picked up a couple of these, absolutely loved them. Anita Blake is someone who is sort of authorized to like lay ghosts and destroy vampires, and werewolves have like legal status and people know they're around, but she is the person who is their executioner if they do break the law. And then of course she ends up falling in love with supernatural people, and it becomes very like conflicted about things like that. She becomes a pack leader of some were people and stuff like that, and her life goes on a very different track from what you think at the beginning, where she's very no nonsense businesswoman. I've got my my legal status and my license to execute and all this stuff. They're really good, but they did take a turn, I'm going to say, after Blue Moon. That's why I pulled this up. I love the one Blue Moon, which is mostly deals with the werewolves in her life, and not as much vampires. But they did take a turn over to becoming exceptionally spicy. Let's say that. Like, very spicy. The more later books are, as far as I can tell, just like entirely about the spicy, if you follow my drift, and not so much about the, finding vampire serial killer type of thing, which is what I enjoyed about these. These are more like detective stories, as well as being like, lots of magic and supernatural stuff. And here's the lore of these vampires and these werewolves and werepanthers and all this. And now the books are mostly focused on the spice. So I go up to about Blue Moon when I look back through these or think of them fondly. And then after that, I'm like, not for me, but for other people, just not for me. So I think Blue Moon was about book 6 or something like that. So, but I really love these. I love Jean-Claude, the vampire, the main vampire in these books. I love him. He is so great. He's so fun. Here is kind of an unusual book. Roger Zelazny's A Night in the Lonesome October. I did not do it this year, but I have done it in the past. This book has 31 chapters and is basically set October 1st, October 2nd, if you will. And essentially, a cast of characters has gathered together to play the game. And the game is really awaiting Halloween night when, the elder gods may rise up. And some of the players are trying to keep them in check and make sure humanity continues on and our Earth continues on. And some of the players are there to assist and would like to see chaos reign and everyone be destroyed and stuff. And the players are all archetypes, they do not have names. There is the vampire, the witch, the detective, the this, and the whole thing is narrated by the dog. It's narrated by someone's dog who's always like, well, my master did this, well, my master did that, and stuff like that. It is very interesting, it's very unusual. It's an older book, it's illustrated, and it is quite short. It's easy to do, it's easy to read along, like read one chapter a night before bedtime, and to get this story about, they're all kind of going around like, well, are you playing the game? Like there's familiar, everyone has kind of a familiar, like, well, I talked to the witch's familiar and they are playing the game, but she's not sure which side yet. It's that kind of thing. Everyone's sort of almost talking in code, but the characters are really unusual. I mean, I think the one guy, I'm 99.9% sure the one guy is supposed to be Rasputin. And, somebody is Jack the Ripper. And so it's really interesting how it plays out. So there is like Dracula and, Jack the Ripper and Rasputin and things like that. And they're all sort of making alliances, trying to figure out who's working with whom and what they're doing with this. It's really fun. It's really unusual. It is out of print, but it is easy to find. I've seen copies just about any time I've been in a used bookstore. So A Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny is a really fun and interesting take on that. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is Icelandic Dracula. So I'm bringing it all back to Dracula once more. Icelandic Dracula, aka Powers of Darkness. This is the best story ever. Not the book. No, the book is great, but the story behind it is the most amazing thing of all time. Very early on, a translator and a publisher from Iceland, contacted Bram Stoker and asked to get a copy of Dracula and to do the translation deal, because Iceland, if you didn't know, is hugely a book country. There is a whole thing. I will talk about it probably as we get closer to Christmas, about the Christmas book flood and all that stuff. So they have actually been early translators of a lot of stuff, which surprises people. Like it's probably easier for you to get your book translated into Icelandic than it is to get it translated into like French or Spanish. So it was not, though, until a few years ago, like 20, 25 years ago, though, that someone picked up a copy of the Icelandic Dracula and realized it is not the same. And so this book, Powers of Darkness, the lost version of Dracula, Bram Stoker and Valdemar Asmundsson, who is the original translator. Then this is translated back into English by Hans Cornel de Roos. There's a foreword by Dacre Stoker, who is like the great nephew of Bram Stoker and is kind of continuing on the legacy and writing books and stuff like that. It has an afterword. Like there's a whole thing because they cannot figure out how this happened. But the book is shorter. It's significantly shorter. A lot of this is like introduction and stuff like that. It's shorter. It has tons more action. People's names are changed. There are fewer characters, and the ending is totally different. And so there's all this speculation that either Stoker, originally Bram, gave them an early draft before the book itself was really out, because he originally wrote it as a play to star his friend, and he was the manager of a theater. And so he wrote it sort of with a friend of his who was an actor in mind. Um, and so they're not sure if this was an early version of the play that he ended up sending to them because he was still working on the book, or if Valdemar Asmundsson just went, "This is boring," and just started making edits on his own. Nobody is sure. There's a case for it either way. It is super fascinating. He will Mina, he's like Wilhelmina and Mina, and he actually, there are notes about that. He didn't care for that name, so he calls her Wilma. So Wilma, the beautiful heroine, and stuff like that. He changed a ton of names, and not because they didn't work in Icelandic. He just did, to names that he liked. But it is super funny because the final scene is super action packed, and it is much sooner than in actual Dracula. So if you but you have to have read Dracula first to appreciate this. If you have read Dracula, if you're a big fan of Dracula, please get your hands on Powers of Darkness. It is phenomenal. It is so fascinating. It is one of literature's greatest, like, mysteries, stories, whatever you want to call it, to me. That it was almost 100 years before someone noticed that the Icelandic version of Dracula is completely different from the original, and they started translating it back into English and into other languages because other people have gotten in on this action and been like, "Wait, I want to read that book." So get yourself a copy of Powers of Darkness along with your Edward Gorey illustrated copy of Dracula. And that's my recommendations this week, and I will see you next week.